Last but not least, of course, our last speaker is Bruno Chaouat, professor at the Department of French and Italian at the University of Minnesota. He's also the former director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He has worked on perceptions of French Jews and representation and memory of the Holocaust, and his recent work focuses on intellectuals, theory, and the new anti-Semitism in France. Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. It's very difficult to speak last. The audience is tired, so are the participants, I'm sure. I promised Alejandro to be brief. I will try to keep my promise. I have just a few comments to make on an overwhelming topic on which modern historians from Bernard Lazare to Leon Poliakov, to Pierre-André Taguieff, to Anthony Julius, to David Nierenberg, to Robert Wistrich have published and continue to publish extremely voluminous books. I am neither a historian nor a social scientist, nor a seer, nor a prophet. I cannot describe social phenomena in a scientific way, and I cannot predict the future. I don't write articles as sociologist of religion Shmuel Trigano does on the future of French or European Jews, or on their lack of future in Europe or in France. I am not a Lacanian linguist. Only in France do we have Lacanian linguists. What would Noam Chomsky think of that? Lacanian linguists then, like Jean-Claude Milner, who predict that since Europe is inherently criminal, Jews have no future in the new Europe. I wish I had their prescience. I wish I had a crystal ball or prophetic skills, but I don't. And unfortunately, I cannot describe empirically the increase or the decrease of attacks against Jews and of Jewish sites in France or Europe. I am not a scientist. Coming then from the field of the humanities, and more specifically specifically from intellectual history and literary theory, I can merely attempt at analyzing discourse, figures of speech, and rhetoric. And so what I modestly propose today is a rhetorical analysis of the introductory paragraphs of a book that came out a year ago in France and may appear soon in English translation. I told you, Alejandro, that it would be underwhelming. So the phenomenon of the new anti-Semitism has been documented, described, interpreted in great details to the point of exhaustion. Here are examples of some theories. Holocaust hypermnesia has boomeranged against the Jews. There is distrust of the nation state, colonial repentance. The state of Israel is considered the epitome of the colonial racist state. There has been a sort of projection of European colonial racism onto the Jews and their national state. There is a sort of eternal European anti-Semitism, and so on and so forth. Many sophisticated and much less sophisticated theories have been elaborated throughout the last 10 or 12 years, especially in France, by psychoanalysts, by structural linguists, by historians of racism, by public intellectuals, anthropologists of religions, and so on. Everybody came up with sophisticated explanations to account for the resurgence of anti-Semitism. I have to admit that I have reached a point of new anti-Semitism theory fatigue. So I just want to comment on a new, more recent development. This recent development I propose to call new anti-Semitism minimization or relativization or even denial. The discourse, the rhetoric goes like that. What we are currently witnessing, I am not talking, I'm just mimicking that rhetoric, right? What we are currently witnessing, attacks against Jews, the worst being, of course, the targeting and killing of Jewish children in a Jewish school in Toulouse in 2012, is not so much a resurgence of anti-Semitism. Those who talk about the resurgence of anti-Semitism have an agenda, a hidden agenda. This agenda is pro-Israel, pro-American, conservative, reactionary, right-wing, racist, imperialist. What we are witnessing cannot really be anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is a phenomenon that comes from the privileged. Genuine anti-Semitism is a reactionary phenomenon, a phenomenon that comes from a dominant socioeconomic class or from the dominant ethnic or racial group. Thus, the socially and economically oppressed cannot really be anti-Semitic. Therefore, attacks against Jews today do not qualify as anti-Semitic. Well, this is the discourse that we can read in the most recent book by Franco-Italian historian Enzo Traverso, now a professor of humanities at Cornell after an already long career in the French university. In his book entitled The End of Jewish Modernity, A History of a Conservative Turn, Enzo Traverso argues that since 1950 and the establishment of Israel, Jews have turned right. They are no longer modern. Exeunt Hannah Arendt, Adorno, Kafka, Mitteleuropa, Viennese enlightened Jews, diasporic Jews, good Jews. The post-Israel Jews, emblematized by certain proper names in Traverso's book, and those names are Kissinger, Raymond Aron, and Ariel Sharon. I don't know why those names are juxtaposed in his book, but we should ask Traverso. They are now part of the Zionist American axis. European Jews have betrayed their mission, or even their very being. They have betrayed intelligence, progress, and the cause of the revolution. So Traverso's book is not exactly a book of history. It's not a history of the end of modern European Jewish European modernity. It's not, for example, an abridged version of Amos Elon's Opus Magnum on the tragic fate of German Jews. Instead, it's a polemical essay that argues that with the establishment of Israel, Jews have ceased to embody a force of progress. They are now a conservative force, a reactionary force. Because they have turned right, they cannot be victims anymore. In Traverso's worldview, victims are on the side of progress, and progressives are the victims of history. With victims at the sacrifice, history can move forward. This is the good old Hegelian work of the negative. And ultimately, suffering brings redemption to humankind. So if Jews are now on the right of the political spectrum, if the hypothesis is true that Jews have now become a conservative force, then they are no longer victims, they are no longer contributing to the work of the negative, to the progress of history toward the redemption of humankind, and therefore it becomes highly difficult to accept the resurgence of anti-Semitism. Jews have to be the haters, not the hated ones, the perpetrators and not the victims. Thus, in Traverso's narrative, Jews have been replaced by Muslims, who have become the new force of progress. Islamophobia is the new anti-Semitism, and thus the new scapegoats, the new victims of Europe are the Muslims. This argument is articulated in the very introduction of the book in the form of a quasi-allegory or a parable that must be taken apart. I am relieved to have my distinguished colleague Gary Cohen here, because I have to admit that I am out of my depth when it comes to the history of European diplomacy at the time of the Russian Revolution. And yet this is precisely that history to which Enzo Traverso is alluding at the inception of his book in a sort of allegory that the old rhetoric used to call a captatio benevolentiae. Captatio, it's captiosus in Latin, right? Alluring, captious. Here we have a sort of rhetorical trap, a narrative as trap. Again, this narrative is not meant to teach us anything about the history of the First World War, of Bolshevism, of Jews during the First World War, of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It is meant as an allegory. I will thus end on this narrative trap, on this captatio. In 1954, that's the opening of Traverso's book, right? In 1954, Isaac Deutscher published a biography of Lev Trotsky, from which Traverso, you say Lev Trotsky in English? No, you say Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky. From which Traverso borrows an excerpt. Deutscher is the famous author of a lecture entitled The Non-Jewish Jew, and thus he is the perfect emblem of the good Jew for Traverso.
Trotsky arrived on December 24, 1917, as the new Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs in Brest-Litovsk, and I quote Traverso, where took place the negotiations with the Prussian Empire for a separate peace. In Trotsky's delegation, there was a certain Karl Radek, a Polish Jew and a subject of the Habsburg Empire, persecuted in Germany because of his defeatist propaganda. Upon getting off the train, they started handing out to the soldiers of the enemy army leaflets calling to international revolution. Appalled, the German diplomats were observing them. Indeed, as soon as they rose to power, the Bolsheviks had made public the secret agreements between the Tsar and the Western powers. Their goal was not to be accepted as a member of international diplomacy, but to denounce it. End quote. So my first remark. For Enzo Traverso, the Bolsheviks in the West embody a force of healthy disorder, of healthy chaos. They denounce the compromises of Western powers. They spread the call to revolution. Thus, they are positive figures. They are exemplary figures. They are figures of redemption through revolution. The good Jewish figures, if you wish. They are Dutcherian figures. Karl Radek is their symbol, a Polish Jew, a revolutionary, a cosmopolitan, persecuted by Germany. Those Bolsheviks, Traverso tells us, were stigmatized in the early 20th century by the Western nations, especially by Churchill's England, as the enemies of civilization. Second quote. A bellicose conservative such as Winston Churchill considered them like the enemies of humankind, as the representatives of, and it's a quote by Churchill, of an animal barbarity. Civilization, Churchill wrote, is disappearing on immense territories, while Bolsheviks jump and frolic like horrible baboons in the middle of cities in ruins and on tops of pits of corpses, end quote from Churchill, right? Now it's Traverso again. Carried away by his eloquence, Churchill did not hesitate to ascribe to Lenin Jewish characteristics. That quote from Churchill in Traverso's narrative, that monster crawling on a pyramid of skulls is none other than the leader of a vile group of cosmopolitan fanatics, end quote, from Traverso and from Churchill. So Traverso is borrowing here from a biography of Churchill by French historian François Bédarida, published in 1999. Of course, Hitler used such rhetoric and such animal metaphors to talk about Jews. But this is not to say that Churchill's violent anti-Bolshevik rhetoric was anti-Semitic. I checked Bédarida's biography of Churchill. Bédarida does not suggest that Churchill's anti-Bolshevik imprecations were anti-Semitic. And there is lots of material devoted to Churchill and the Jews that seems to suggest more or less that Churchill was rather a Philosemite. Of course, I grant you that Churchill was no saint, and he spoke the language of his time, that of race and Orientalism. I grant you that he saw many Jews who were Bolsheviks, but he explained Jewish Bolshevism not by some inherent Jewish trait or innate Jewish perversion, but by the persecution of the Jews. There is actually a chapter, pages by Robert Bistritz in his last book, Lethal Obsession, about Churchill and the Jews, which is very interesting in that respect. To expect that the British statesman of the 1920s would speak the language of our time, the language of anti-racism and anti-Semitism, is disingenuous or intellectually indigent. Suffice it to say that in the context of the time, colonial, imperial, Orientalist Europe, Churchill was not particularly an anti-Semite, and to compare him to Hitler is unworthy of a genuine historian. Churchill was as strong a supporter of Zionism as he was an adversary of Bolshevism. He saw the Jews split, ironically not unlike Enzo Traverso. between the good Jew and the bad Jew, except, of course, in reverse. The good Jew for Churchill being the Zionist Jew, and the bad Jew, the internationalist, the Bolshevik one. So instead of talking of Churchill's anti-Semitic imagery, Traverso extrapolation from Bédarida's biography, Bédarida, the French historian, talks about Churchill's ability to anticipate the threat of communism. But it is as though Traverso had internalized the alleged complicity between the Jews and the Bolsheviks. This is why he reads into Churchill's anti-Bolshevik attack an anti-Semitic attack. So where he sees anti-Bolshevik, he sees anti-Semitic. Indeed, in Traverso's worldview, Bolsheviks, revolutionaries in general, are associated with the Jews, and the great Jewish tradition is revolutionary and can only be that. A conservative Jew is no longer a Jew because he has excluded himself from the long tradition of the revolution. And thus, if Jews have turned conservative, and if they are attacked, then this is not really genuine anti-Semitism. It has to be something else. But what? We see how Traverso is faced with some kind of cognitive dissonance or delusion. A real Jew can only be a revolutionary. A conservative Jew is not exactly a Jew. Therefore, attacks against Jews today, if we grant Traverso his argument that Jews are conservative today, which is easily falsifiable argument, are not exactly anti-Semitic attacks. Lastly, Traverso illustrates with an analogy that is meant to help the contemporary and non-specialist reader, the reader like me, who is not versed in the history of the Russian Revolution and even less in the history of European diplomacy in the early 20th century, what is at stake in this scenario. And I quote again from Traverso, "The state of mind of the German plenipotentiaries in front of their Soviet homologues is very hard to grasp today. One would have to imagine the arrival of a delegation of Al-Qaeda at a summit of the G8. The Jews then were identified to Bolshevism, that is, to a world conspiracy against civilization," end quote. Things, you see, get complicated and need to be explicated. What are the equations implicated in Traverso's allegory? 1917 German plenipotentiaries are somehow the equivalent of the industrialized democracies, the G8, that claim to embody civilization, but that for Traverso embody plutocratic globalization. As for the Bolsheviks, i.e. revolutionaries, i.e. the Jews, they are the equivalent of an Al-Qaeda delegation. What does that mean? It means that the Judeo-Bolsheviks of the yesteryear have been replaced not so much by the Muslims, the now familiar thesis of Islamophobia as the new anti-Semitism, but by the most extreme, the most radical progeny of Islam, the vanguard of an alleged transnational cosmopolitan revolution. So one must take the measure of such an allegory, of such a narrative staging. It suggests that for Traverso, Islamist movements such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and even Al-Qaeda are imaginary threats based on xenophobic and Islamophobic fantasy nurtured by the Americano-Zionists, i.e. the conservative axis. I conclude with questions that should be addressed to Enzo Traverso. Are the Bolsheviks of yesteryear the equivalent of today's Islamic terrorists? Was bin Laden a neo-Bolshevik revolutionary, or even a Radek or a Trotsky redivivus? Finally, and corollary question, are today's Jews plutocratic and nationalist conservatives who resist a genuine revolution, namely the international Islamic revolution? Thank you.